I think in the wake of increasing political violence, significantly worsening mental health, widening wealth inequality, increasing really death and despair in America and worldwide, we need to, and we are at a point where we need to reframe and recenter. We need to think about where can we and what can we debate on and what do we disagree on. And the reason that I say this is because with the assassination of Charlie Kirk, we've already started to hear increasing hatred and animosity between what is described as the American political left and political life. We are at a point where violence appears to be going to lead to more violence. And as an ER doc, I think one of the, really a few of the frameworks that I have learned through medicine and applied to my medical profession as well as my personal life, I think will be useful frameworks for moving forward and recentering correctly. In emergency medicine, we call it the ABCs: airway, breathing, and circulation. There are a number of ways and a number of practice patterns that differ between emergency medicine physicians and, quite frankly, physicians in general. But there are a few things that are universally and scientifically established as foundational and inalienable and essentially unarguable. And that is really the evidence-based, that is the science part of medicine as opposed to the art part of medicine. And the science of society is something that we really need to get back to and figure out. What are we going to universally agree on so that way we can have healthy and appropriate debates otherwise? What is going to make us come back together? And the reason that I think historically the frameworks that have been used to kind of set the boundaries, establish the framework for society have been problematic. They've been law and they've been religion. And I think to a certain degree, using those two things to establish the framework is a bit of a circular argument, because it's kind of like you can't decide what's important while, using an institution that is based on deciding what's important. It's a bit of a chicken or the egg situation. I think medicine and particularly emergency medicine are good frameworks because they are the frameworks for how to save a life. So then if you can apply the framework that's used for a good, emergency medicine physician on how to save a life, I think that is something that should be used to to be applied more broadly. I think that, we're at a point where we've kind of lost our guiding star. It's difficult to decide what is important, what are the priorities, what do we really value. It's kind of like a free-for-all in the mind where it's just like, well, what you say is important when what I say isn't important. People go back and forth, and there has to be in humanity, and to me there is in humanity, a set of priorities that must be adhered to. And to me, the framework through which this should be, applied is centered on, number one, the golden rule. And this is the golden rule in medicine too: do no harm. I think that doing no harm in medicine is the same as peace. It is the same as nonviolence. It has to be the number one priority. And I think that it has to be the priority even when there has been violence, because if you start with violence and continue with violence, then you're only going to move forward with that. And that is really the opposite of the number one guiding principle in medicine, and the number one, what should be the golden rule and what should be the guiding principle in life. And I think that it speaks to empathy, which is highly important too. Doing no harm, doing unto others as you would have them do unto you. But also remembering that this is not something that you need to apply to only other people. I think there are plenty of well-intended people that, and I think I've certainly been there too, where you put other people ahead of yourself at the expense of yourself. And this is really the circular importance of the golden rule. Taking care of yourself, putting the oxygen mask on yourself, and also putting it, and once you've done that, and hopefully while doing that, also doing that for other people. And if that can and should be agreed upon, as was really, the number one belief of someone like Gandhi, I think if that can be done, then we will lead ourselves toward a more perfect union, lead ourselves toward a place where we can truly understand and get on a path towards life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. Because the founders of the United States had the right ideals. Maybe they didn't apply them well themselves, and certainly they've appeared to be applied even less, and the expression of those ideals has been even less frequently realized throughout time. But those ideals were good. And, so far the books that I've written, Dismantling Generational Trauma, which I think is key, understanding and reflecting and saying that just because something has been done to you that's negative doesn't mean that you should do it to someone else. This is the old saying that hurt people. This is violence begets violence. This is the connection of refusing my goal, my aspiration, my vision that, we need to set aside what's been done unto us that has been difficult. And there have been things that have been done to me personally that are maybe unforgivable curses, to use the words of J.K. Rowling, but I reject the notion that I need to continue to apply them. So yeah, Dismantling Generational Trauma, wrote a couple, some poetry as well. And the other one, the New Theory of Relativity, which is really about emotional intelligence, emotional maturity. And, the next book that's going to come out is that will be out soon, is about how I think we can, we can think about the golden rule as it applies to individuals, communities, and systems, which is through the lens of codependence. And I think that the spectrum that we really need to think about this on is from independence to interdependence, which is a goal, to codependence. Initially, codependence was described in medical communities, described with chemical dependence, alcoholism, and, you know, also eventually applied to what was described as personality disorders with borderline personality disorder. And I think that through capitalism, through even religion, through social media, technology, artificial intelligence, we have strayed so far away from interdependence, a healthy human-to-human connection, to codependence, to where now the center is codependence. And, you know, by becoming codependent on one group, we are also, you know, being attached to the other extreme, which is independence, a complete distrust of people that are not identically like us. And, you know, it's essentially criticizing groups, people, ideas that think exactly like us, becoming codependent on that. And then rejecting, disrespecting, and ultimately being violent towards other people that we have, for some reason, classified and really misclassified as inhuman, or different than us. Potentially another, or a good analogy that I think to consider this framework from, you know, independence to interdependence to codependence is also understanding toxic masculinity and toxic femininity. I think that those need to be defined so that way we can see and identify what interdependence means in terms of masculinity and femininity. The domineering toxic masculinity, I think, can fit into this spectrum when you really apply it to the independent mode of thinking. When you say, what does a toxic man genuinely or generally do? There is this fixed false belief that I can do it by myself, I have to do it by myself, and there is a solely, unfortunately, distrust for everyone else. There is my way or the highway type of thinking. That independence is toxic masculinity. And I think that through the Me Too movement and through a lot of advancements in society, we have seen and broken down some of the barriers and identified some of the examples of toxic masculinity. Where does this come from? Well, I'm going to get into that in a little bit, but I think the other thing that's important to identify too is toxic femininity. And why is that important to identify? Because I think a lot of the identification of toxic masculinity has placed the belief on some men that masculinity itself is toxic. And I think that is harmful, and that will further isolate and lead to violence, and has led to violence. So genuine masculinity, productive masculinity, real masculinity should be celebrated, validated, acknowledged, and discussed. Just as genuine, valid femininity as well. But what is toxic femininity? I think that it's fair from my also, personal experience, and reading, to consider toxic femininity as codependence. It is this belief that of the ultimate self-sacrifice, of being someone who is putting everybody above yourself. And I think that this often is presented as, and this is the reason that this is toxic, is because this is often presented as selflessness, when in reality it is selfishness. And that inability to distinguish that reality is a problem, but the reality itself is also a problem. And the reason that it appears to be selfless is because it is putting someone before you, and genuinely at the expense of you. And someone needs to wonder, why is that being done? There's this idea of dominance and submission, and someone needs to be pure. If someone is purely submissive, then they're putting themselves at the bottom of the totem pole. They want someone dominant. And that can be true physically, emotionally, whatever the case may be. And the reason that is selfish is because at the end of the day, the person that is exhibiting that behavior, number one, has a false idea of what selflessness is. And number two, the reason that it is selfish is because they want the credit for being selfless. And if someone wants credit for being selfless, then that is selfish. I think that another way to consider the similarity between codependence and toxic femininity is to consider the importance of the difference between ladies first and ladies only. I think that while a true gentleman does allow ladies and does, respect the chivalry of ladies first and understanding why that's important, doesn't mean that it's, always going to be the case, but that as a guiding principle is a good one. But it doesn't mean that the focus should only be on crediting the woman in the relationship. It should be only about putting the woman on the pedestal, because just as you should not put a man on a pedestal, you should also not put a woman on a pedestal. This is codependency. This is, a little bit of how I view and why I think applying the medical literature, the medical way of thinking, and how I frame this, a healthy framework, is how do we find that moderation? How do we find our way back to healthy masculinity, healthy femininity, and ultimately I think where that leads to some degree is androgyny. I think that is ultimately where, celebrating, investigating, and bringing together healthy masculinity and femininity, I think a lot of it, involves that. Now, I also want to say that even though I think that this is perhaps the best application of what could potentially be described as a medical framework to society more broadly, I don't want to suggest that everything needs to be characterized in terms of a medical framework, because I think medicine, maybe not as much, but psychiatry has increasingly, and culturally, we have increasingly pathologized, I don't think that's a word, but overly criticized people who if there's a normal bell curve of human emotion, we're trying to, criticize or describe as pathology someone who's maybe a little bit away from moderation, maybe less than 1 standard deviation as opposed to 2 or 3 standard deviations away from the mean of normal human emotional spectrum, if you want to characterize it as such. So I'm not in favor of, putting a name on every single variation of human emotion, because I think that variation should be celebrated. And no one's going to always fully, and no one should stay at the median or the mean of human emotion, because if that is the case, then you're effectively a robot. So, I think that we don't want to over pathologize normal human emotion, because that has led to the over critique of normal human emotion, I believe, has led to this false belief that you hear culturally, which is everybody needs a therapist. There's this obsession now with, therapy's the answer. And I think that, number one, things have continued to got worse emotionally. So that's clearly not the case. But I think that by advocating for that line of thinking, that everyone needs that, number one, this is discouraging or disempowering the role of a community, the role of a family, the role of friends in therapy, in connection, in getting to interdependence. That is the healthy, happy medium. Not forcing a mental health professional, spending you to spend some time with that mental health professional. Yes, there is value. There is extreme value in that profession, because there are people that need it. But just because there are people that need it doesn't mean that everybody needs it. There's this belief that instead of it being an adjunct to happiness and peace, that it is a means to fix someone. And I think that that's just a wrong way to go about it. And I think that all the proof that not everybody needs a therapist is in that statement itself. And the reason that I say that is because if everybody needs a therapist, nobody gets one, because there's no way to, there aren't enough quote unquote therapists in the world, and burdening the system to that degree will make those who serve in that profession, more burnt out, more overwhelmed, more helpless and hopeless, because they're just going to be overwhelmed. And two, like I said, we really need to think that if you're saying that everyone needs a therapist, then what is the role of other normal human connection? What is the role of community? What is the role of friends, family, if not to be interdependent? This is the connection that has been lost. People are isolating, separating work, politics, religion. They're separating themselves into these categories, disassembling their own identity. and putting it in certain buckets inappropriately. Sure, there are times where your professional life is going to stay there. You're not, the laid back nature and the professionalism that you exhibit at work is not going to be the same way that you navigate friends, family. But if you're going to somehow isolate your emotional truths to a discussion with a therapist, what are you discussing with your family and your friends? I've heard relatives that say, and this is classic, someone needs a therapist, and when you're talking with them, they just want to talk about sports and the weather. Is that where we've come, where when you're with relatives or friends, you're just talking about sports and the weather and you're not talking about real stuff, and you're only going to a professional to share how you really feel? Are you able to even characterize correctly how you really feel with them? Are you being honest with yourself when are you being true to yourself when you interact with, humanity? And I think the answer has to be no. This is where the interdependence has become extreme into codependence and a combination of independence. So if you made it this far, thank you for listening. Please support by sharing in any capacity. And if you're interested and if you're able to support and read some of what I've written, please do that. Books are on Amazon and Kindle, which is, so any app on any smart device that you might have. Dismantling Generational Trauma, VOYAHER, and Euphoria, which are short collections of poetry, and the new Theory of Relativity. Those are some of what I've independently published at this time. And I'll talk more about this soon, because I think that this should also be applied to a greater degree to various systems. And when my book comes out on this about codependence, I would very much appreciate you supporting it at that time. So hope everybody has a good day. Peace.